I'd first of all like to start by thanking our speakers and our discussants for an amazing whistle-stop tour of some of the issues that are begged and will need to be addressed at the Paris COP. As chair, and the next 20 to 25 minutes will consist of a question and answer session, basically with the panel, questions from the audience. But as chair, I claim the privilege of asking the first question, and I will put it to Jean-Charles, since he is immediately to my left. Jean-Charles, what do you expect to be the defining theme of the Paris COP?
Well, that's all right. I try to summarize in this way. Madame talked about the INDCs. My vision of what happens is that we have the INDCs. That's a good progress. But if you look at that in the eyes through the lens of the people in developing countries, I had a phone conversation with India. Well, we have made an effort to make explicit what we can put on the table. But what we are gaining from that? Why that? And my way of presenting finance is there. I mean, well, they want something. They don't really believe. They will ask for that. They don't really believe that there will be a lot of money. There will be money, that's important, on the Green Climate Fund, and we have to do the job. But this is not. They are realistic. And this is why I come back to finance and to say that we have to demonstrate our capacity in the next steps to negotiate the capacity of really deriving a lot of the savings all over the world through the low carbon investments. And this what happens they created their own World Bank, I mean their own banks, and they are now looking at what we can do to improve the financial intermediation systems to redirect. They will not be signed and ratified in COP21. But if simply we stand in the posture of saying, well, guys, we have the INDCs, that's okay, we'll convene the business to come and so on and so forth, they will not believe us. So I think that what is happening now, and today, I mean, in these days, that we have the Brazilians who have signed an EFO for the Sub-Saharan Africa, who said to the North, but we want to be serious about that. They know that there will not be a real deal there. But to what extent we define something for the near future will be really important. So the link between the INDCs and the way to have some gains of cooperation on the INDCs.
So global cooperation.
Global cooperation.
Global cooperation.
And they say that. They say that they want to share the pie. The diplomatic word of Cancun was totally not enough put for one. Equitable access to development. That's political rhetoric. It changes from the sharing the pie problem. Definitely.
Would any of my fellow discussants like to pick this one up?
For the floor. Go for the floor. Yeah.
Okay, we'll go to the floor. So can I have questions from the floor, please? Neil, if we could take the microphone to the back, please. Thank you. And some more hands while we're... Okay.
I'm Neil Strachan from UCL. I particularly enjoyed all the presentations, but particularly the modelling slides. I thought they were excellent. My question to the panel is, when do you think the 2-degree window will close, or is it shut already?
Who wants to take this one first?
Well, I don't mind starting. Well, we keep worrying that the 2-degree window has shut. I think one of the most encouraging things I heard was that the pledges, the INDCs, added up to 2.7 degrees, which was way closer to 2 degrees than I ever expected from that. And I think the other thing that we have learnt over the years is that actually reducing emissions increases efficiency. So, for example, there is an Italian cement or an Italian-owned cement company, Italcementi, who now use CO2 as their metric of efficiency globally. because it brings in all the major things. So I think what's happening now is that instead of emissions reductions being seen as a cost, they are increasingly seen by companies who start to really focus on that as a way of actually improving their efficiency. And I think those two things together, particularly alongside the INDCs, will mean that we probably do get there, or get close to it over the next decade.
Paul, do you want to...
Yeah, I don't think the 2-degree window will ever close because it is a political target and it is incredibly important as a sign-up from 194 countries to a level of ambition, a large level of ambition. As we know, the 2-degree window is probabilistically defined anyway. Our model is not quite as optimistic about 2.7 degrees on the INDCs as the climate tracker one, which I think is the one you're referring to, Jill. But I think anyway, the fact that the world's governments have signed up to that target is enormously important. I'll never forget Jeffrey Sachs when he came and gave a seminar here and he was asked a similar question. He said that has to be the gold standard because that is what the nations have signed up to, and that is what is going to keep them ramping up their INDCs or ramping down their emissions in the political process on which we are now engaged. And so I think it's absolutely crucial that we never try to close that window, because that window is doing an awful lot of work politically in terms of getting countries to become more ambitious.
Okay. Does anyone want to... Jeff?
Yeah, I mean, just to say that rather than the 2 degrees, I would like to think in terms of how far we have actually got from the 4 or 5 degrees we might otherwise have been chasing. So it's a glass half full and glass half empty. I think we've made an enormous amount of progress, but we may or may not get to 2 degrees, but I'm more satisfied with what we've achieved.
Jim? Okay. Right. Nick, I seem to remember that you had your hand up, and I seem to remember that you had your hand up. No. Okay. Nick?
There's a lady just here. A lady just here.
Okay.
Here comes the Nigel.
It's a question about flexibility and stability and consistency. The consistency of target that Paul talked about. One of Jim Watson's slides, which was a McKinsey marginal abatement cost curve, just showed how much things have changed. The relative costs of the technology on that curve are now, well, frankly, wrong. And actually, if you look at the IPCC data published in 2014, the relative costs of nuclear, solar and wind are also wrong. That implies that we need a great amount of flexibility going forward in choices that are made by policymakers and by industry, but with a consistency of goal. How do we square that apparent circle?
I'll take it.
Okay. Jim?
Yes, so I was using the slide to illustrate the points I made, not don't take the data literally because it is wrong, yes. I mean, it was probably wrong in 2010, but it's more wrong now. And in both directions, as you indicated. So solar costs are much lower than anybody expected, and nuclear costs have refused to fall, as Paul said. In fact, they've risen. I think I'd use the UK policy, as Jill referred to, as an illustrative example here, because on one hand, we don't know how those technology costs are going to change, and I'll just talk about the power sector rather than the whole thing. But, I mean, it's one of the reasons I'm rather wary when people start asking for us to plan exactly which power stations we're going to build over the next 20 years using precisely which technologies. I think we do need a policy framework that has flexibility in it so that you allow for both upward and downward trajectories in costs you didn't expect. So auctions, the role of markets and competition is really, really important. And obviously, if you go to different countries, they will have different views on this. But certainly for our context, I'm very much in favour of, yes, showing the direction of travel, give a certainty on the goal, which is decarbonise the power sector, but where you can use markets and competition to actually reveal which technologies are going to deliver what you want.
Oh, brief, I think that's... My instinct would be to reply to that. We don't know. But what matters is the credibility and the confidence. Give me the sense that 2 following years you will create a credible system. Might be with a chance of doing a lot of things. It's a very unpleasant metaphor, but, well, after all. You know, during the Second World War, in late 39, okay, France is defeated in May and June. We nominated a guy who was very good in organizing the story. Okay? In May 40, France was constructing more tanks and airplanes and better quality than the Germans. Why that? Because of the credibility of the guy and because of the common view that we have to. This is a very disagreeable metaphor, but I think you cannot predict if the world really now starts to do something. In a developing country, you know, they are in a bifurcation points. They can either go in carbon-intensive infrastructures or no carbon-intensive one. So this question of timing depends upon the way you create a credibility. And this is why I think that the 2 degree is useful. The problem is how to sell that. A pure utopia, and that's bad, or something which is our cruel target.
Does anybody want again?
So I'll speak with my Doosan hat on, actually, as business. What you need, I mean, I've sat on both sides of the table. I've been a government official negotiating with industry, and I've been on the other side asking government for what we want. But what you really need is that strength and certainty of the target and an understanding that government is committed to that target. And actually straying from that, even if you've got policies in place, if you have an unfortunate comment by a government minister that appears to be moving away from that, that's really unhelpful. It's really unhelpful for investing, and what happens then is you get no investment. So I think there does need to be a recognition that this is all quite difficult stuff. We're putting in place policies that are quite new. We get it wrong. They need fixing. But you need to know that the target is fixed and that the government is committed to it, and that the policies will be fixed if they seem to be going off course. That's what you need as business.
Thank you very much. Can I take a question from the front here? And if we can bring the microphone along. And if you could tell us who you are, please. And I'm going to ask all of our questioners to do this as well.
Hi, yes. My name's Hannah Bronwyn. I'm part of the project finance team at Linklaters, working in the energy sector. And maybe this question is best directed at Paul, but I'm happy for anyone to take it. I was just wondering if you have any comments on why governments around the world, but also in the UK, tend to focus on subsidies to promote renewable generation, whether it's directly from the public funds or socialised in the way of contract for difference, which inevitably then gives rise to this question of how much renewables are costing, rather than relying on putting a proper carbon tax in which fully internalises the negative externality of carbon dioxide emissions, and then just let the market get on with it, and that's actually revenue generating.
Bliss. I might have planted that question, but I can assure you that I didn't. Having said that, the answer is I don't know. In the sense that carbon taxation is so obviously the right way to tackle this particular problem. With intelligent use of the revenues, and when most people talk about environmental taxes, they forget that they raise revenues. They don't just raise prices of carbon, they raise revenues which government can then use in a variety of different ways. And of course, if we were to do that and we were to remove environmentally harmful subsidies on oil, which globally to the tune of something like 500 billion, we would not only reduce carbon emissions by 10% and get economic benefit, but governments would be in a much stronger fiscal position. They would be able to use some of the non-subsidies expenditure and some of the revenues in order to compensate low-income households. They would be able, until we get a global carbon tax, which is what we have to be aiming for, they would be able to put in place special arrangements for the competitiveness of their industries. And even the driest neoclassical economist in the United States would agree with those statements. So it is a mystery to me why we fail to take the obvious high road and use the revenues in a way that is distributionally fair and sorts out competitiveness issues through the transition, and instead we engage in these incredibly complicated schemes of renewable subsidy, which actually doesn't help the industry as much as it might be helped, because the subsidies go wrong, the subsidies are too high or they're too low, the industry fails to take off, or the industry has a huge boom and a surge in the way that we've seen in the UK recently, so the subsidies are summarily cut, and people who thought that they had nice, secure jobs into the decarbonisation sunset suddenly find themselves on the scrap heap. It is a really extraordinary policy failure. But unfortunately, as someone who's talked to the Treasury a lot about carbon taxes, who's tried to proselytise in the European level for carbon tax at the European level, which of course is anathema to the UK government, because carbon taxes, any kind of taxation, cannot be European. That's a kind of ideological sticking point. Well, we have to continue to fight the good fight, but that would certainly be a way in which we would move, at least cost, towards the decarbonisation goals which governments say they want.
Thank you very much, Paul. Jean-Charles.
I have the explanation.
Go for it.
Go for it, yes.
No, because I believe a lot now, given my age, in the mental map. I can tell you that's true. When you were talking about carbon taxes, environmental taxes in the late 70s in France, in the country, you met people at the Treasury. They are good people. They are very selected, nice people. They were saying, no, the fiscal system are neutral. They don't interfere with the choice of the people. They are simply here to raise money, and that's it. They have no influence of how the people make the economic choices. Well, little exceptions, okay, fine, the smoke. But doesn't exist. And now we have just this evolved. But this explains why we had so many problems to discuss in the same room, rising taxes for energy and the recycling of the taxes. The past two events in France over the past 7 years, you have the Ministry of Finance there and the guy working on taxation and never discussion, okay? And the Ministry of Finance will say, well, I wait for the guy to make the vote and announce a carbon tax without talking about the recycling twice. There's a real problem in the mindset. And now we have the same problem with the people from the Finance Ministry who support the idea as well. The monetary systems and the financial policies are neutral for the microeconomic behaviors, which are obviously false. But they are rooted in this mental map, and what is dangerous is they are very good and strong. So hard to convince.
Can I say something, and perhaps disagree a bit with my colleague on the right-hand side of the table. I mean, it's quite. I mean, there is a land far away where markets are perfect and policymakers behave perfectly and send consistent signals. It's not a land that I think any of us will ever really see. And if you, I don't know, maybe Joe can comment on this, but if you move to the business side of it, you're looking for policies that you know will stick and you know that you will get a return on. And at the top of that list, if that's your criterion, it would be something like a power purchase agreement or a feed-in tariff, which you can take to a lawyer when it all goes wrong and enforce it in a court. Then I'd put the next one, probably cap and trade, because it's certainly volatile, but it's volatile in a way that companies understand. You have volatile markets for all commodities. And the one you least trust is a piece of taxation. Just take the example of the carbon price floor in the UK and the reliance that people put on it before it was summarily removed. So I think, I think Paul and I need to fight this one out over a glass of wine afterwards, I think, because where you're sitting, I think, affects how you see these measures.
Jill, would you like to have a crack at this?
I would like to. I was talking to somebody a couple of weeks ago who was talking about the carbon reduction commitment, which I'm sure you're all very well aware of, but I think is basically it's a carbon tax at about £16 a tonne for companies that are large energy users that aren't in the EU ETS. And he said to me that his organisation paid absolutely no attention to it whatsoever. It had no board level significance at all. But when they'd had to comply with it initially, they had actually gone through an awful lot of trouble. They'd had to find all of their gas and electricity contracts and bundle them together. They found waste. They saved a lot of money. They cut a lot of waste when they were implementing it. But after that, it had no merit at all for the organisation in terms of reducing their fuel use. And I think it's just psychological. I think if you give people money for doing something, they're more likely to do it than if you tax them for not doing it, unfortunately. It may not be rational, it may not be logical, but organisations are not rational or logical. They're comprised of human beings. We all know how fallible we are.
And just to say, I can see from Jean-Charles' face that he thinks French are perfect policy makers, but we do not.
We were, but we didn't know that. We were.
Jim.
Yeah, so collegial as I am, I'm also going to disagree with Paul, actually. So there'll be an interesting fight later. I mean, not on the principle, because I think carbon taxation is absolutely right, economic principles, but politically difficult for all the reasons Jim Ski outlined. But I also want to make the link to the topic I was talking about, which is innovation. A carbon tax, flat carbon tax, is necessary but not sufficient to give you the innovation we need as well, because it will work and it will incentivise whatever's near market at the time, so you need other things. And that's where things like feed-in tariffs have done an incredible amount of work to bring technologies which have been well away from the point where a carbon tax of any conceivable magnitude would help them to the point where it may be that it would. So I definitely think they're necessary, or emissions trading, but it's not sufficient to do the kind of job that we've got on in the timescale we need.
Well, we certainly agree with that. My last slide said that they were part of a package. But if you look at the countries that have managed to implement carbon taxes, and Sweden has a carbon tax of more or less 100 euros a tonne of carbon dioxide, which is a very large carbon tax indeed. They tend to be the ones that are most secure in their decarbonisation pathway, because they are giving a signal which both the companies and the households do trust, and the price difference is sufficient for them to make a difference. So, sure, the Swedes are different, they can do it. Other countries have done it to some extent, and I still think that those countries that can do it and can make it stick will find that they get a surer route to decarbonisation, with all sorts of other flanking measures to do with behavioural stuff and do with innovation as well, absolutely. But I think the evidence is there that if you can do it politically, it is very beneficial to do that.
Okay. We had a question in the middle here. Sorry, if you could put your hand up so that they there we go, yes. Could you pass the microphone along, please? Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Name, please, if you would.
David Norse, UCL. Right? The question relates to the pathway to the 2% target, or what percentage you like, and the McKinsey curve that both Jim put up and one of the audience remarked on as being inaccurate, which I accept is inaccurate. But one of the things that they used it for was to argue that there was some low-hanging fruit which you could put to governments to say, well, look, you can actually go forward at minimal cost, if not with a positive benefit. That argument seems to be potentially even greater now that we have an idea on the co-benefits, particularly some of the other environmental co-benefits. And I'd welcome the responses of the panel to that question.
Who would like a go at this one?
I'm happy to start. I mean, just to say I accept what you say, and especially when you add in the co-benefits, but the problem is when you go to policymakers, at least in my experience, and you say, well, look, there are lots of these negative cost measures, the first response is, why aren't people doing it? And when you have to say, well, actually, there are a number of barriers. I mean, Jill's mentioned the ones at a board level. There are similar research on, households and communities, which show all the complicated reasons we don't pick it up or we ignore it. And trying to make the argument, well, yes, there's financing barriers, you need to pay for the upfront costs, so here's a lot of policy you need to shift people and pick up the whole low-hanging fruit. It starts to seem very economically illogical to people who kind of buy into the very dry economic framework there. So I think there is a bit of a problem with framing it in that way, when there are things that you do need to do, even if eventually, even over 2 or 3 years, lots of people and firms are going to save a lot of money by implementing them. So that's where I think some of the challenges are.
Okay. Jill, would you like to?
I was going to refer back to, I mentioned the report I did for the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership earlier this year. And there, the companies that had actually found those low-hanging fruit, and one of them was GSK. And what they had done was they had decided that they were going to put in place a carbon team that would go around looking for carbon reductions. They had a budget. And they were able to change some of the rules. So instead of payback within 2 years, that was extended to 5 years. And they found initially 30 to 40% efficiencies that could be made. And then they go back 2 years later and they'd find an awful lot of that had been achieved. And there would be another 30 to 40% efficiency that could be made. So they're not, I mean, energy is not a large part of their cost, but they said nevertheless, they had to make a conscious effort. They had to put in place a team. They had to give it a budget. They had to give it an objective. But having done that, then they uncovered the low-hanging fruit. But it wasn't, there was an initial cost to it, and they needed that will. And it's the same, you know, we all know it's the same with householders. Who wants to go up in the loft or whatever and sort that out? And it's the same with governments, is how do you uncover those? I kind of think what you need is a sort of INDC for companies and households, where everybody takes stock of what they got and decides where they could save money, because then they will go ahead and do it. And if they were required somehow to take that inward look, then it might uncover it. But pricing alone won't do it, because we're lazy.
Yeah, Paul. Pricing will help, but it won't do it alone. I absolutely agree with that. And I think the most misleading thing about the McKinsey curve is it was actually shown on one of the breakout boxes that Jim showed, which is that there's a perception that because it's negative cost, i.e. you can save money, that it is easy to get people to do it. I mean, the straight economist will say it can't exist because otherwise they would have done it, and there's lots of research now on why that is not the case. But even so, there's a kind of perception, well, it's sort of easy because it's low-hanging fruit and you can just pick it. But actually, it's low-hanging fruit behind quite a lot of policy-style razor wire, where policymakers have somehow to guide the people through to take those actions, which, if they take them, as Jill said, they will save money. But the number of companies that are like GSK and actually do it is far outnumbered by the number of companies that don't, just as the number of households that do it is far outnumbered by the number of households that don't. And it is that impetus, that perception of that ability to design policies that will get through the razor wire to the low-hanging fruit that seems to me to be the policy takeaway from those figures.
Okay. I'd like to take two questions over here, if I may. So first of all, the gentleman, could you put your hand up so that there we go. Okay. Can you make it fairly quick now, because we're in the last few minutes?
Sure, thank you. My name's Dustin Benson. I'm here from Green Alliance. We're a think tank based here in London. And my question is really about bending the curve on emissions. If we're at the point now where we're bending the curve on emissions, I want to think about what the risk of locking ourselves into an unbent curve, if that makes any sense. So I guess my question for the panel is, what is the biggest risk of carbon lock-in that you can see? And you're not allowed to say coal, because we know that one already. Thank you.
So who wants to have first go at this one? What is the biggest risk?
I have one response for me. It's the bifurcations in the urban dynamics in the developing countries. The most irreversible.
The urbanization issue.
Yeah.
Yes, I would agree with that.
That's because that's the mobility and one example. Your comparison between Atlanta and Barcelona. Yeah, that's very simple. France was a country with a lot of Barcelona, with dense cities and so on and so forth. And we stopped to have that, and this link to the financial systems and what happened after 1995. Okay. Now, what happens is that the French landscape changed a lot. You have a large urban sprawl because you make money simply in buying low-cost land. You build big shops there, and then you earn money. Not because you will sell tomatoes and clothes, but because the land, the price of land increases a lot, and this explains a lot of what happens in France since 2 or 3 decades. So this That's what happens in developing countries.
I'll take one more response to that from the panel, if anybody wants to chip in.
Well, I suppose actually to agree with that, but say that there are probably, in Western Europe at least, there are still promising signs of that being reversed. And I would say Tesco selling off its stock of land for housing now. But I think that Barcelona versus Atlanta diagram is one of the most compelling that we can have. So I agree, transport, heat, buildings, but urbanisation.
Okay. I'll take one last question from the lady with her hand up.
Thanks very much. I'm Anna Hill, founder of River Cycleway Consortium Limited, which is proposing Thames Deckway. It's a clean energy cycling superstructure for the Thames and other tidal rivers around the world. So my question is what can be done to encourage the role of social innovation and new business models, such as social bonds, that encourage interconnection between policy, research and social need.
Thank you.
You punted it over to me. Well, I mentioned social innovation, so I suppose I should answer the question. Again, I'll go at it through an example rather than talking generally, because it's such an amorphous term used in many, many different ways. I mean, one phenomenon we've seen in the UK, which perhaps is close to what your interest as well, is the rise of community energy alongside a number of other types of community activity. And that started to happen partly due to drivers of policy and partly due to a driver of, in many communities which are rather different, of wanting to do their bit on climate change, linked to other broader social capital building initiatives, tackling poverty, social cohesion and so on. It's not only about energy. I think what we can do to encourage is a difficult question in one way, because this action, rather like the INDCs, is bottom up. And I've always puzzled over what a government, say looking to national government, to have a policy on community energy. It's rather a tension there, isn't there? Because you're trying to get a body that operates in a rather top-down way to do something which encourages and fosters bottom-up action. But I think one thing certainly I've come across in the work I've been involved on community energy, which I think we could do, and it comes out in debates about things like the feed-in tariff, is how do you value the broader social benefits of community action versus lots of individual measures. Now, we know from the research, and there's a lot of research out there, mostly qualitative, that there are those benefits out there, social cohesion being one, bringing communities together. There's all sorts of things that you can put your finger on looking at the qualitative research, but that runs straight into more of a quantitative frame of mind from policymakers when they say, well, demonstrate the extra benefit of the feed-in tariff for community energy, and we'll consider it. Yes. And so that's the bridge you've really got to cross, and I haven't seen anybody do that quite yet. Or you've got to persuade the policymakers that actually you need to take a multi-dimensional approach to this and not just think about the immediate monetary return, but think about the social capital you develop as well.
Are there modelling systems that can take people out of the equation to get to a better solution?
I think people have started to look at that. Maybe Jim wants to come in.
Jim. Just to make a slightly different point. I mean, I think it is a struggle to move in that direction in the UK, given the very centralised nature of decision-making and the lack of discretion that many decision makers at the local level have about budgetary allocations and the way things operate. And if you compare us to Germany, that is the big difference, the amount of discretion and autonomy that people employ. So we can exhort people to get into community-based schemes, but it's going to be a very big struggle unless people can actually have the capacity to make their own decisions. And there I would agree with Paul completely that the money matters a great deal, actually, when it comes to making sure that people do get the benefit of the decisions that they make. I think the interesting thing in the UK may be the development of mayors in some of the larger cities with greater powers. And for me, that is something that could be really quite important, because it will move real decision-making away from London to closer to where people really live.
Okay. I said that we would finish on time, and I'm going to do my very best now to wind us up. So I would like to sum up the conversation that we've heard this evening by saying that I think the fossil fuel age will eventually prove to have been easier to get into than out of. I personally veer between pessimism and optimism, and I see signs of both accumulating at an ever faster rate. The great philosopher of science, Thomas Kuhn, defined a paradigm change as a situation where problems accumulate to the extent that the existing paradigm is thrown into crisis. And it seems to me that that may well be what we're going through at the moment. I would like to now turn to more important matters. There are a number of people in the team, in the backup team, that have made this event possible. I would particularly like to single out Ellie Forward, who is standing at the back. And Ellie, would you like to come forward, please? No pun intended. If I may, I would also like to single out Anna Martinez, who has backed up Ellie manfully over the last few weeks, since both were dropped unceremoniously into this problem by me. So, I believe we have something for both of them. Excellent. So if you'd like to bring them down, please. So, I'm afraid I don't have flowers for our panellists, but I think they also deserve them. So consider yourselves awarded virtual flowers on behalf of all of us here. And I now declare this meeting closed. I would be grateful if you would